All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next to the last webinar for the 2025 Winter Webinar Series. Tonight, we welcome Michael Keeler with Ohio Native Concepts. And he's going to talk about matrix planting for biodiverse gardens. A little bit about Michael. So he is the founder of Ohio Native Concepts, and he has a background in natural resource management. And so he incorporates not only that uh, mind for the biology, but also the artistic eye to developing some really cool gardens through Central Ohio. Let's see, what else do I want to say about you before I get started? Yeah, he loves natives. He does not want to put any non-natives. As a matter of fact, he will help you remove non-natives and invasives from your property so that he can put in some really great native plants. So, Michael, I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So yeah, today we're going to talk about matrix planting for biodiverse gardens. We'll start with a little bit of an introduction and some definitions, but eventually we'll jump into kind of building a 100 square foot matrix garden. Uh, we're going to keep it pretty simple so that we can kind of just get through the basics of it. But hopefully you'll be able to take this and use it on your own space. All right, so we kind of already covered a little bit about me. So I'll just say a little bit more, and then we'll jump right in. But through ONC, we really try to create resilient native plant landscapes that welcome nature and don't work against it. Um, a lot of our landscapes over the last, decades and decades have been unsustainable, focused on plants that are non-native, and just don't support the wildlife like they could. So that's our main focus. And really our vision is to help to redefine and guide the landscape industry into something that is more sustainable, something that recognizes that nature is all around us and should be all around us. And we're doing this so that we can make a better world for future generations and also the current ones. We're all currently living here, so it's nice when we can have confidence that our environment is healthy. And native plants are a great way to do that. So I like to start with just the basic definition of a matrix. So a matrix is just an environment or material in which something develops, a surrounding medium or structure. So in this case, when we're speaking specifically about a planting, the matrix aspect of that is the grass and sedge species. Um, a basic planting can have as many grasses or sedges as you would like. I typically recommend sticking with just one species when you're starting out. Um, as you kind of get the hang of it a little bit more, you can start incorporating additional species within the planting. But what's great about these plantings are that they are designed specifically to mimic our natural plant communities. So we are giving the plants the environment that they want to be able to form these very specific communities that they would normally form in the wild instead of trying to take a plant and force it to adapt to our site and our style, which is, in the past, typically spacing with lots of wood mulch in between them. Uh, and it ends up making our plants grow in a way that we're not happy with. One of the biggest complaints I get from people who are starting out in native gardens, besides weeds, it's also that their plants flop over. And the first thought process behind this is typically, well, we need to stake it, or maybe we'll add some more plants here and there to help support it. But this matrix planting is a great way to ensure that your plants don't flop for multiple reasons. But one of the main reasons is that it really forces a root matrix underground. So you do have like the matrix of the grass and sedge species. But below ground, the roots are also all mixing and intertwining and working together, which kind of forces some root competition and helps encourage those roots to dive down and get those really deep native plant roots that we are typically looking for in our gardens. So when we are looking at plants to use in a matrix garden, it's a little bit different than you start with another type of garden. The main thing that we're going to be looking at is how a plant reproduces, how quickly it can reproduce, and the site conditions that favor their reproduction. These are three really important aspects to a garden design that is often overlooked, and it can lead to certain species taking over, certain species vanishing from your landscape on year 2 or 3, um, or it leaves big holes in our plantings that are just really an invitation for weeds. So we kind of already hit some of these, but the main benefits of matrix gardens are that they take advantage of every single square foot. There is not a space wasted in a matrix garden. We'll see in the example, but typically you can expect around 1.3 plants for every square foot of garden space. And that density basically blocks out all weeds. Obviously, you can still get some weeds in during the establishment period, or if just seeds get in there from wind or birds. But in general, we're putting so many plants in the ground that there's just not enough room and resources for these weeds to move in. And it's a really great way to provide this really full, lush, beautiful landscape that lasts throughout the entire season. So in every matrix garden, you should have plants that start blooming in as early as April and bloom all the way through October. Um, with some asters, we can definitely get into November. But in general, it's just all about having this really full, lush landscape with blooms throughout the entire season. But the main thing that is really beneficial about these gardens is that it allows our insects and our pollinators to complete their entire life cycles right there in your garden. Um, it's wonderful to plant milkweed, but that is not the only plant that monarchs need. They actually need nectar sources as well. So the photo I have there of the monarch is on a button blazing star, which is a wonderful nectar source for monarchs. Um, so having that milkweed on your site is great, but we need to make sure we're having nectar plants and habitat. The grasses create wonderful habitat, really great for our ground nesting bees as well. Those roots really keep the soil kind of open, allows them to burrow in a little bit easier. It also allows our pollinators to forage more efficiently. When we have individual plants kind of scattered around, it's very difficult for the insects to transfer plant to plant, especially when we're talking about the larval stage. If you have milkweeds planted 3 feet apart, it's very difficult for those caterpillars to make it to the next milkweed plant. So when we're planting them very densely, they can actually reach those plants because they're all touching. Um, the other thing that's great about it is that we utilize lower cost plant plugs. So most people who are familiar with natives are probably kind of familiar with plugs. You have your container stocks that can be quarts or gallons, but the plugs are usually 2.5 inch around their sized 6 month to 1 year old plants. And not only are they cheaper, but you can more easily plant them close together. It's very difficult to plant like 2 gallon pots very close together. You really end up just digging one giant hole. You can also plant a ton of these plants in the time that you would plant just a fraction of larger container stocks. And then probably one of my favorite parts about it is that it removes the need for annual mulching. So annual mulching is obviously not something that happens in the wild. And when we do it to our landscapes, we're actually forcing these plants to kind of stay in this mode of establishment. We're not allowing them to spread and self-sow freely. And on top of that, it's very expensive, time consuming, and it's kind of difficult labor. It's my least favorite garden job. So after the first year of when you do your actual planting, we never mulch again unless a client wants, a small border around the planting. We're really big on clean frames to make the garden look intentional. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is build a plant community. Plant communities are really just groups of plants that share the environment with each other, interact with animal populations, physical environment. These communities occur naturally, typically just due to their shared environmental requirements. So they require the same sun, soil moisture, soil type, and that allows them to kind of grow together and balance each other out. When you have species where we're trying to pull from different habitats and different types of plant communities and mixing them, it's really hard to predict how they're going to behave. And that's when we run into problems with our gardens where, uh, you've this happens to a lot of early native gardeners is that they hear goldenrod is a wonderful species. They see a volunteer goldenrod in their yard and they allow it to stay uh, because they're trying to do the right thing, their heart's in the right place. But later they find out it's Canadian goldenrod, and their entire planting is kind of at risk of being overtaken. So really, it's just about this natural extension of right plant, right place. So yes, we're going to consider sunlight, soil moisture, soil type, but we're also going to consider the plants that they grow with naturally in the wild. We're going to consider their reproduction methods, rates. We're going to consider their height and bloom times and bloom colors as well as a design aspect. But overall, what we're trying to do is just create a really functional, low maintenance landscape, but that's also beautiful and presentable to our neighbors so that we can be good stewards of our native gardens, so that we are encouraging others to do the same and not pushing them away. So a huge aspect of this is plant sociability. So the easiest way to think about this is just how sociable a plant is. Think of it like an introvert. They like to be alone or maybe in small groups. And then an extrovert, they want to be the life of the party, right? So to figure that out, the main thing we want to look at, like I said, is that reproduction method. Are the seeds carried by wind? So are they able to spread in other parts of your garden easily? Do they have rhizomes that spread really rapidly and maybe make them a little bit more aggressive? Or do they have heavy seeds that fall really close to the parent plant and don't get a lot of spread outside of that area that you've planted them? And then we also need to look at the reproduction rate. So how quickly a plant can spread and multiply. The main way that I like to think about this is if the seeds need any kind of treatment. So some of our seeds don't need any kind of stratification. So that cold period of thawing and freezing and thawing in the winter, those can spread a lot more easily, but they need to have that perfect temperature in the spring to germinate efficiently. We can also have seeds that need multiple seasons of stratification. They may need scarification. They may need to be digested by an animal first. So those are all going to play a role in how quickly these plants can reproduce. And then the plant adaptability is really about taking into account species that can grow in more than one location. So wild geranium is a great example of this. It can grow in full sun and in full shade and anything in between. It can grow in dry sites all the way to pretty moist sites. I wouldn't say wet sites, but moist sites. And it's always going to be a combination of those two on how it performs. But if you put it in a really sunny, dry site, you will have to expect slower growth, less spread. If it's in really loamy soil, partial sun to partial shade, that's probably where it's going to perform the most. So really taking that into account is going to go a long way to making sure that all of your plants play nicely together. So there's a ranking system. It's been done a few times by different groups. You'll see everything from 3 levels to 6 levels. Some people use just the low sociability, moderate, and high. I kind of like to think about it with both, with level one plants being that low sociability. These are the introverts. If they go to the party, they're going to hang out with just a few people, uh, but most of the time prefers to be alone or just with those close friends. Level two, that's where we start getting into that moderate. They may form small masses and groups. You'll start seeing individual populations of maybe 5 to 7 plants growing in clumps, depending on the species. Then when we get to level three, that's where we start to see their populations repeating throughout the landscape, kind of forming these larger colonies. There's not much else in between them. It's very much so just like that individual species in a big group. They can also form in drifts, which is really just where they snake through a landscape. And then level four. So level four are the ones that we typically want to, I don't want to say avoid altogether, but they're probably more suited for a multi-acre restoration job where you're going to be growing by seed anyways. These would be things like common milkweed. Those, while a wonderful plant for our monarchs, it can be difficult in smaller gardens and it can be difficult in some residential areas. And until recently wasn't even legal to plant or share seeds of. So it's definitely considering those types of species, and really with that level four, we tend to stay away from those in a design standpoint. So what we want to do is group these species together. So if you are doing a small garden, the best thing you can do is stick with level one or level two plants. They're going to behave together pretty nicely. They're not going to take over and escape your garden. Um, and then if you have some more space or you're out in the country and your neighbors may not have as much of an opinion on what you're doing on your land. Level three and four is great to stick together. You can also do level two and three together, but the big idea here is that we want to avoid sticking level ones with threes and threes, or twos and fours. That's just not going to create that balance that we're looking for in the garden. And then we're going to start running into those problems of overly aggressive species, and the species that just can't stand up to that. So talked about wild communities. And the picture on the left is of a forest in Licking County. This is pretty early in the season still. You can see the trees aren't fully leafed out yet. The forest floor isn't fully covered, but we've got some really nice spring flowers coming in, May apples, geraniums, bluebells, trillium, ginger, these really great spring wildflowers. And as that fills in more, you'll start to notice that you can no longer see the forest floor. Uh, this is where the matrix garden idea comes from. You'll see on the right, that's that same forest just about a month later. So it really starts filling in. The entire floor gets covered. And this is a fairly healthy woodlot. This is a site that I restored years ago, and we removed a ton of honeysuckle and multiflora rose, and just saw this wonderful rebound um, after getting those species out. And we're really starting to see the results of that and just have this really nice, dense understory. And that's actually going to help keep those species from reinvading. Uh, Having that entire ground level blocked out throughout all of the seasons, that's going to kind of shade out the ground. And some of the seeds that might be dropped by birds like honeysuckle, uh, those are going to have a lot harder of a time establishing in a very dense planting like this. So when we're replicating this in our garden, this is kind of what it can look like. So this is another woodland garden. This is one that we did in Upper Arlington. Uh, we used a mix of a few different sedges and other ground covers like wild ginger. You can use lots of different forbs mixed in as you kind of develop your style with this. Again, I typically recommend sticking with that single sedge or grass species early on. But we incorporated wild ginger, wild geranium. I believe there's golden ragwort as well. And those are all really great plants to get that ground covered, start blocking those weeds out, and start to encourage that plant competition. So we're going to jump right in here to the layers of a matrix planting. Really, there's two main ones that we're going to focus on tonight. There is a third that I'll get to, but it's not necessary in every garden. That first one is that ground cover layer. It's a grid of grasses and sedge species. Um, Typically, this is, it varies, but typically sedges are going to be more in the shade gardens, woodland type gardens. Grasses are going to be more of the full sun, or even partial sun uh, plantings. And then we have our seasonal layer. So this is the layer where we have our blooms from April all the way through to October, if not November. And the way we're going to accomplish this is by using repeating masses and drifts. So groups of 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, just keep it odd numbered. It As it grows in, the odd numbers don't matter as much, but early on, you can really tell. You can easily see the individual plants, and it looks a lot more natural to stick with those odd numbers. And the third layer would be considered the structural layer. So this would be if you're going to have shrubs or small trees in your landscape. I would select those first, plan out where those are going to go first, plan out where they might be casting shadows. But for a pollinator garden that, is in full sun, or maybe you already have a tree for your shade garden, you don't really need to consider that layer, except for the site conditions that it produces. So in this ground cover layer, it's really the most important part about this matrix garden. It's what makes it a matrix, right? So it's the ground floor for the plant community. This is going to be replacing your wood mulch. This is going to be blocking weeds. This is going to help encourage more stability in the plants above ground, because it's also not only providing that support above ground, literally, it's also creating that root matrix that is having or causing those roots to dive even deeper into the ground. I also really like that it provides a lot of structure or unity and flow, however you want to say that. It basically creates this canvas that covers the entire garden. Uh, and when you look at the garden, it makes it a lot easier to read. A lot of the issues that I see with native gardens, that maybe someone's just starting out, or they did one of those no mow May things, and then they never really found their style with the garden, and it has a lot of non-natives in it. Is that they don't look unified. There's no flow to it. It presents, and I don't like this word. I don't use it often, but it prevents messy. Uh, but by providing the single species that covers the ground like this, it really brings the entire planting together. And typically we're looking at around 60 to 70% of the planting is going to be these grass or sedge species. Um, the species that I really like are over to the right. So for shade gardens, Pennsylvania sedge, it's kind of a home run plant. It's extremely adaptable. It creates a really wonderful carpet. Um, for areas of your yard that you don't really use much, but you kind of still want that turf aesthetic. Pennsylvania sedge is wonderful for that. You don't have to mow it. It's a great replacement for tree lawns or health strips. It technically gets 12 inches tall, but as you can see, it kind of lays down and fountains over and kind of sticks around 6 inches. So it falls into most ordinances for the most part, as long as they're not, pulling the plant up to measure it. Cytodes grama is really my number one grass that I use for partial sun to full sun sites. It just creates this really great airy canvas to plant in. It stays nice and compact. It's around 2.5 feet tall when it's in seed. So it's not going to be this like 3, 4 foot tall prairie grass that is going to kind of get too competitive in the landscape. Sometimes little blue stem is it's rough to have in a residential landscape. It's a wonderful plant. I do use it, but typically if we have a little bit more space, I'll use that. Prairie dropseed is another wonderful one. It's got this wonderful mounding shape. Uh, Again, pretty adaptable to the site, stays pretty low. With the seed heads, you're looking at around 4 feet, but most of the time you're going to be around 2 feet with the actual blades of the grass. It makes a really great border plant, even if you're not using it in the matrix setting. Planting this around the edges of a landscape that you have plants that are, 2 to 4 or more feet tall, it really kind of frames it in. Purple lovegrass is one that I think is really underutilized. It's just a really great matrix species. Again, it makes a really great border species as well. But as you can see, it has this really airy quality to it. And the more of them you get together, so especially in a matrix, it really just looks like the plants are kind of just floating in this like purple dust. It's just a really spectacular plant. But we're talking more 12 to 24 inches. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to have a 12-inch grass in the middle of 4 foot tall plants. It's going to make that competition not really work together. The plants are probably going to get a little bit more aggressive, and you'll see less and less of that matrix benefit. So just stick with lower species if you're going to use purple love grass. So if we have a 100 square foot garden, so that'd be a 10 by 10, uh, we're going to be looking at around 81 grass or sedge plugs. And I know it sounds like a lot, because it is a lot. But again, we're filling every space that you would normally fill with wood mulch, that is forcing the plants to stay in this mode of establishment. And instead, these grasses are just filling in and blocking out all of the weeds. They are providing that support, and again, that unity and flow. So for this example, I selected the Cytodes grama, mostly because it's my favorite. And it behaves very well for this. So no matter which grass you're using, and as long as you're using one that's appropriate for a matrix, just avoid things like switchgrass. That's a much bigger grass. It needs more space. It doesn't work well in the matrix setting. Um, but in general, you'll be planting every 12 inches. So for here, because we've left a 12-inch border around the edges, again, those neat, tidy edges really go a long way. It'll come out to, 9 by 9, which is 81 grass or sedge plugs. So that brings us to our seasonal layer. So this is really only going to be around 30 to 40% of your planting. You can increase it a little bit. It's always really tempting. This is what we get excited about. It's the flowers, or the forbs. But kind of sticking to those percentages is really going to help this community form on its own and come together, and allow you to get all of the benefits out of it. It just, you have to be a little bit patient. Um, but what's great about it is that if you're using plugs, like I usually recommend, you already are kind of have to be patient because we're talking, at least a year before they really start filling in. But really, you're still looking at 2 to 3 years before this community forms itself. So we like to use repeating groups of forbs, again, odd numbers, plant them in masses or drifts. So we'll see an example on the next page, but a mass is just really a clump, a group. You can make it lagoon shape or round or however you want to do that. Just 3, 5, 7. Um, and then drifts kind of snake through the landscape. So it depends on the species, but showy goldenrod, for example, which is a much, much less aggressive species than something like Canadian goldenrod. It behaves really well if it's given the right parameters. So planting it next to other species of similar sociability levels, like sky blue aster, those will help keep each other in check. Um, but those I would normally plant in kind of a drift. So it kind of snakes through the middle of the landscape. Um, because they in the wild form these colonies that kind of snake through. Something like purple prairie clover, same thing. I really like to kind of like drift those through the landscape. They bloom at the same time as butterfly weed, and they're just it's it's got to be my favorite combination. That orange and that purple together just looks wonderful in the landscape. And the purple prairie clover has so much movement in it. Even the lightest wind will cause the flowers to kind of blow in the wind. And they have this really great aesthetic to them, even when they're not in bloom. I think the seed heads are beautiful. They last into the winter. And same with the goldenrod and the asters. I mean, these all of these will have this really nice native seed heads that'll persist throughout the winter, and kind of continue that interest throughout all of the seasons. So because we're working with a 100 square foot garden, we're kind of sticking with a limited palette here. I chose 6 forbs. Um, the larger your garden, the more you can do, but I would still caution against using too many. Typically, 2 blooming at the same time is all you really need to keep the planting looking really presentable and intentional, but also getting those blooms that we want, right? So these all kind of overlap a little bit, up until, the coreopsis and the beard tongue, they'll stop blooming a little bit before purple prairie clover, then showy goldenrod and aster kind of come in for that last stand. Um, so we're basically taking into account the species height on where it's placed in the garden, its sociability ranking for where it's placed in the garden, its bloom time, so that we don't have species all together that are going to bloom in one time and none on another area that at that same time. So it looks disconnected. We really want them to be kind of scattered throughout in these masses and groups. So let's take a look at what this looks like on a 10 by 10. So again, we're sticking with 12-inch spacing for the forbs. This is true for almost all of them. There's exceptions, things like blue false indigo. We give that more space right from the get-go. It gets a little bit larger, acts a little bit more like a shrub. Um, Aromatic aster, it can take up a ton of room, and I really like to give it that room because it fountains over and mounds really nicely. And if you squeeze too many in around them, it can kind of compete with that, and they don't really fall and mound in the same way. But in general, we're sticking with 12 inches spacing for the forbs as well. So they're going to be planted in between whatever grass or sedge species that you chose for the matrix level. They'll come out to about that 30 to 40%. And as you can see, we've got in the middle, that's our showy goldenrod. It's our tallest species. So for a garden like this, because we're working with a square, it's likely that it would be intended to be seen from all sides. So putting your tallest in the middle as opposed to the back makes more sense. Now, if you were working with a foundation of your house or a fence line, you'll want your taller ones in the back, shorter in the front, just like we're kind of used to with design. Um, so that one, like I said, we drifted that through the center, and then we've kind of anchored it in with the sky blue aster. So that's going to really help force those two to like stay in competition together, keep each other in check. They're definitely the two most like high sociable plants in the design. But I would still really put them at like a 2, probably more like a 3, maybe in between, with the beard tongue, landsleaf, butterfly weed, and the purple coneflower kind of falling into like the 2. Again, maybe a little bit more. So we're sticking kind of all in the same here. It makes it a little bit easier. We do kind of play around with mixing sociabilities a little bit. But again, in smaller spaces, I really encourage sticking to those same levels. And especially when you're starting out. And then the rest of the species are just planted in masses. So because it's a small garden, we're using 3 species, or 3 individual plants for each mass. Um, Again, the larger the garden, the larger those masses can be. If we're doing a site that is, 4 or 5 times this, we're going to be using most likely 7, 9, maybe even 11, depending on the species. Um, and just keep repeating those. And what's really great about this is when you're all finished with your matrix and your forbs, you get this 10 by 10 square, right? And you can now take it and rotate it 90 degrees and just keep adding sections to it. So it's endlessly expandable. You can continue to use the same 10 by 10 design and just repeat it over the entire landscape, but with just slight rotations. And what this does is it allows you to just design something small. You can really focus on that 100 square feet, and then you can now cover this huge area and it looks seamless and intentional and well designed, like somebody went through and they planned where every single plant went, when really it's just that 100 square feet. Um, and I know it can be kind of difficult when we're looking at a square to imagine it in your landscape, but it really is just taking your bed shape, doing a quick sketch of that on graph paper, gridding it out so that each square is just 1 square foot. Or you can, increase it if you want to do 4 squares as 1 square foot. And then filling the every spot up with that kind of formulation. So for this one, it's 81 grasses, sided scrama, and 49 forbs. So we get 130 plants. So that's where we get kind of that 1.3 plants per square foot. And that does include the border on all sides. But in this small space, again, if we take the borders out, it's only 9 foot by 9 foot. And we're able to have 130 plants, two of which, the goldenrod and the aster, are keystone species. So they support a wider number of pollinators than other species. We have one monarch host plant, that would be the butterfly weed. We have blooms as early as April with the beard tongue and as late as October with the aster. And overall, we have host plants for over 150 different species. Now, these are species that rely on these specific plants. This doesn't include all of the generalist species that they are also supporting. This garden could support hundreds and hundreds of species in just a fairly small location. So you really don't have to give up a lot of space. If you're kind of worried about providing enough, this is just such a wonderful start to start with something manageable, get a feel for the process, kind of figure out what plants work and don't work. You can really learn a lot from a small plot like this, and then just kind of effortlessly expand it over and over again. And another thing that I really love about it is that we can use this for rain gardens, woodland gardens, pollinator, like full sun pollinator gardens. You can really use the concept for any size garden, as long as you have enough room to at least get 6 or 7 plants in there. You can at least create a little mailbox planting that's really dense and still has that grass matrix aspect to it. So we're going to take a look at what some of these projects can look like in a home landscape. So this is a client from Tiffin, Ohio. So it's a little bit closer to you guys than it is to me, I think. This is about, I think, the furthest garden that we've ever away from us that we've ever designed. But this homeowner, their house was built on old farmland. You can still see farmland behind them. And he was just really unhappy with like having this completely flat yard with rolled out turf on it. He's kind of an avid bird watcher, and he was putting out feeders, but he wanted more from that, right? The feeders will only do so much. So what we did is we came in and we really just followed the shadow of the house there and the shape of their existing bed, created a bed that kind of just wraps through. I'm a big fan of leaving turf grass pathways, typically one mower width or maybe 2 mower widths, depending on the size of the garden. Um, Again, this is showing intentionality to our neighbors. It's not just wildflower seeds thrown out in the front lawn. This is defined edges. We have pathways through it. And the great part about these pathways, besides being access for maintenance, which is really important, it encourages you to walk through the garden. A lot of gardens, it feels like we're encouraged to stay out of them, and that there's these perfect pictures with forest shrubs, perfectly trimmed, with jet black mulch, and it feels like sterile, unnatural. But having these more wild gardens and having pathways in it really encourages you to walk through it and experience it. And I'm a really firm believer in that if you are experiencing it, if you're seeing the pollinators in action on the flowers, you'll fall for it, or at least I hope you do, and kind of become addicted to it. It's just exciting. I still think about, and it wasn't even that long ago. It's in the last 6 or 7 years when I first kind of stopped and looked at a flower, and it was a purple cone flower, bumblebee, and I thought, wow, this is like pretty special. This is really cool. And it might have been the first time I was really curious about the natural world since I was a kid. We kind of grow older and we forget. We stop experiencing nature, and these wild gardens are a great way to bring that home, and kind of keep that natural wonder alive. So right there on the left, you can see it was May 2023. That was the day it was installed. This was a very simple process for this one. The turf grass was already struggling. So what we did is we used a product called Weed Guard Heavy Duty. So it's a recycled paper product. It's organic. You just roll this paper sheet out. We usually do a few layers of it just so it lasts a little bit longer. And then you cover it in a couple inches of triple shredded aged wood chips. The aged part is pretty important because it really breaks down. It kind of has a slight compost component to it. And it will basically smother the grass until it's dead. Um, I find this to be a much easier way than trying to line up cardboard, making sure we're removing all of the tape, all of the labels. And we also have to make sure we're using cardboard that isn't going to leach chemicals into the ground. Studies are few, but we're finding that there are some cardboards that have toxic chemicals in them that will leach into the ground as it sits and degrades. And I feel a lot more confident using this product, besides just being a lot more efficient. So 2 months later, that's kind of what it looks like. He has this really great water feature in the middle of it. But again, because we're planting so densely, it's forcing that root competition, and the plants can just explode in that first season if you're doing a spring install. Your results are a little bit different if you do an install in the fall. I am a huge fan of doing installs in the fall, but you don't get that like first couple month explosion like this, that you might with doing it in the spring. So in 1 year, this is the results. So we have these groups of purple coneflower. There's nodding onion on the edges. We've got the blazing star kind of acting as a little bit as like a focal plant. It's definitely the tallest species in the garden. Even have some volunteer sunflowers in there. You can see their bird feeders kind of in the background there. Um, and what was great about this is that he came back this year and said, "Hey, I want to do more space. I want to get rid of more lawn," because he was just so happy with the results of this. And he just went from turf to this in just a few months. Well, turf to this in just a few months, and then in a year to this. And so we designed another one. We incorporated additional species, kind of mixed it up a little bit. So he's got even more diversity. And you'll also notice there's quite a bit of partridge pea in there. Uh, we use that for a very specific reason. It's a legume, so it's a nitrogen fixator. It can help build soil pretty rapidly. His soil was, even for native plants, it was a little rough. It was pretty compacted. The grasses definitely are going to help break through that clay. most of our warm season grasses lose a good majority of their roots each winter. They die off, and that just builds soil very deeply, which is really important, and is why our prairie grasses can store carbon much more efficiently and for longer than even trees can. So this one's in Clintonville. This is right down the street from me. So this client had kind of experimented with some natives right up near the house, but they couldn't quite figure it out like as much as they wanted to. And they were also dealing with a lot of English ivy. You can see over to the right underneath the redbud tree. And they had boxwoods in front of the house that they really just didn't want to take care of, trimming them and making sure they look good. And then they also had this work done from the city. So they had this chunk of concrete cut up and a line to their house dug out. So they thought that this would be a great opportunity to mix it up. So because this is in a neighborhood here in the city, we decided to go with a series of islands. Again, this is one of my favorite ways to incorporate plantings in a yard. Um, because again, we're not just cutting out this giant square, filling it completely, and then kind of like dusting our hands off and walking away. This is showing a lot of intentionality to the neighbors. They have said that neighbors will kind of walk in and walk through some of the lower pathway there, which I think is really, really great. That was just super kind of special to hear that people are just walking their dog and they kind of take a walk through and check out the plants because it means they're curious and they're at least hopefully open to it. And we also kind of designed it specifically because their mailman delivers on foot. So the main pathway off to the right near the redbud, we call that the mailman pathway. So we gave him a nice straight shot to the mailbox, and hopefully he's getting some enjoyment out of it as well. So this is the last one that we will look at before we kind of move on to questions. We can review anything that anyone wants to. But here we have a landscape. This is in a suburb right outside of Columbus. And this client had this really, really nice old growth oak tree in the middle of their backyard. And for years, she tried to spread every type of grass seed you can imagine under it, trying to get something to grow. But between her dogs and the dappled light of the oak tree, she just couldn't get anything to grow. I mean, you can see it's just kind of a muddy mess. And this is pretty common underneath oak trees. Not only are they blocking a lot of the light, they also use a lot of water. So big plants, they need a lot more water to live. And turf grass is extremely thirsty. It is the number one irrigated plant in the United States. It just uses an insane amount of water. So when we limit access to water at all, you start getting this. It just can't hold up to it. So instead, a better choice would be a sedge. So this is a woodland garden. So what we did is you can see on the left, that's installation day. So we used a mix of sedges. I believe this one would be pretty sedge. So that would be Carrick's, or sorry, that's um, rose sedge, Carrick's rosea, and Pennsylvania sedge. And then we used a combination of some low growing spring wildflowers. So we have wild blue phlox, wild columbine, wild geranium. We put some bare root bluebells in here. And on the right, you can see again, this is 2 months later. You can see a lot of it has really started to fill in. You'll definitely see less filling in early on in a shade garden. All plants need light, and even shade plants, they still need light to be able to spread and grow. So they're just typically a little bit slower. But still, for 2 months, I think that that's really starting to fill in and looking great. Um, and it won't be too long before you won't be able to see the ground. I'm really excited to see it this year. I'll probably go back around May. That'll be a really great time to see it because a lot of those sedges and wildflowers will really have taken off. Um, It's always hard for me to talk about this garden because this oak tree unfortunately was hit by lightning last year. Uh, I need to follow up and find out if it's going to make it. But it took a lot of damage. It's been there for a really long time and survived a lot. And now she's got this wonderful garden below it. So I really hope she's going to be able to keep it though. So these are just some up close shots of it. Again, you can see that there's definitely still space that we need to fill in, but that'll just come with time. The sedges will keep filling in, and especially when these wildflowers go to seed this year, that's going to really go a long way. They're going to self-sow, continue to spread. The columbine is a wonderful, wonderful spreader. Um, and yeah, we kept this one pretty low to the ground. So you can also keep things really low and you don't have to go crazy with super tall plants. You can keep the palette really limited. At the end of the day, anything that we do with native plants is going to be better than turf grass. So I always encourage people to kind of like take it as it comes and don't get too worked up in the idea that we need to have 80 different species in one garden. Hopefully you've got some other spots in your yard that you can use other species in. And then you can kind of have a little bit more control over these garden spaces. So what I would like to do now is take some questions. Of course, it can be about site prep, about matrix gardens in general. I think we've got only a couple minutes here, so I apologize. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear.
Well, I'll go ahead and moderate that. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and I will get
Cool.
it to Michael. So I'll take care of the ones from the chat that I saw first. Starting with, everybody wants to know, is there a list of plant sociability? Is there a good index?
I wish. So this idea started back in World War II in Germany. After the war, they had a lot of area to fix up. And so they wrote this paper, a couple scientists wrote a paper on how they could do it. And they took into account the sociability rankings. So it didn't really apply to our plants here, different species. Um, and it hasn't really been adapted fully, especially at the level that we need it to be. So it really does come down to like doing that individual research. So it does take additional like engagement. Um, but I think it's worth it because it creates these really functional gardens.
Okay. Do you have a good place where you purchase plugs? Is there somewhere that, even like Northeast Ohioans can purchase plugs?
Yeah, so one of my favorite resources is if you go to Meadow City, they are a native plant nursery. Their website, though, they have resources of different landscapers and growers throughout the state. Um, and then if you're kind of looking for bulk, because typically with these you're have to order kind of a lot of single species, Izel Landscapes or just Izel.com is really great. You do have to buy flats of like 32, 50, or 72. But again, if you need 80 plugs, and you get one neighbor in on it, you can order a flat or two flats and share. So yeah.
Okay. Um, Tell us again what the name of the paper was that you used to smother the grass.
Yeah, so that is Weed Guard Heavy Duty. You can get it on Amazon or their own website or AM Leonard. Um, we use that because we're doing this commercially, but you can, of course, still use it. I think it's around $100 a roll, but you can. I can't remember off the top of my head how much you can cover, but it covers a lot. Most of you will not need a whole roll, so you'll have it for years.
Okay. What are your thoughts on pine needle mulch?
Yeah, so I like pine needle mulch as like an edge mulch if you want to keep a clean border. In general, we're mulching to smother out existing vegetation and just provide some moisture retention and that initial planting. So pine mulch just doesn't have the weight to it. It doesn't hold down paper in the same way. So again, on the edges, but I wouldn't really recommend it for doing a full conversion.
Okay. The one garden under the oak tree, will it survive any oak leaves? I'm sure it will, but
Yeah.
what's your
So
thoughts?
because of the fence, which is put up for her dog, she has two German shepherds, and they'll just tear anything up. Um, because of the fence, she did have to lightly remove some leaves because it just traps them all in one area. But in general, yeah, those plants love it, especially like the wild blue phlox. They really do need that leaf litter layer to continuously come back. If she were to clear those leaves every fall, the wild blue phlox would eventually vanish.
What about soil enhancer? Do you need it? Is it beneficial or is it not?
Yeah. So we don't amend soil at all. The only product that we use is the triple shredded aged hardwood mulch and the paper product. If we're treating invasive species, then we're going to be using very targeted and low rate applications of herbicide. Things like honeysuckle will cut and just paint the stump of that, but otherwise we don't use chemicals, and I definitely recommend staying away from all fertilizers, organic or not. We really want those roots to dive deep on their own, and fertilizer encourages rapid root growth on the surface, and that's really going to give you flopping and just keep those roots too shallow.
Okay. So when you're planting things so tightly, do you worry about mildew or mold?
So some species, bergamot is a, that's species, even when you space them out, you still kind of run into that. But no, in general, the biggest worry that you have is that if there is a pest or disease and you've used one matrix species, that could be an issue because you've now got your whole planting is relying on that matrix species. But in general, the grasses are not really an issue with that. It's typically larger leaved plants. So yeah, it's not really an issue for us as long as we stick with like the species we know work. Like I said, bergamot's like the number one that it it loves getting powdery mildew.
So the front yard garden, you had a little bit of a border around it. What kind of border did you put around it, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, so the client actually did that. So it was just bricks that they had. They had a brick pathway that had been worked on, and they had all these extra bricks. So they just kind of like dug a trench, set those in. But borders you can have so much fun with. You can use rocks, you can use branches, you can use branches like willow ones, and you can like drive them in as a stake and kind of create what's called a wattle fence. Those look really great in woodland gardens. So I always encourage people using some, creativity with it, and just whatever you can to make some kind of nice defined edge, even if it's just mulch, goes a long way.
So is family diversity a goal in your matrices?
Yeah, so hopefully, the plants that you're getting are going to be straight native species that are grown from wild collected seed. So there should already be some diversity in there. Even if you're getting it from the same grower, hopefully, again, they're either using like their own grow sites where they've got diversity mixed in. It's really the main reason why, even when you find natives in big box stores, I typically tell people just leave it. Besides having pesticides and fertilizers in it, you run into a lot of cloning and just repeated genetics. And yeah, we don't want to bottleneck the garden into failing. So just high quality nurseries, typically that's enough to avoid that.
Okay. Repeat again the percentage of planting of the sedge grass layer.
Yeah, so typically you're going to be looking at 60 to 70% of the planting will be that. So 100 square feet, you'll have about 81 with borders. And then your forbs will make up the rest. Have about 49 and 9 by 9 or 10 by 10.
Okay. So the maintenance, do you recommend, is there a watering schedule and do you have to cut it back at the end of year? What's the cleanup for that?
Yeah, so Watering for sure. So these plugs are thirsty. They're young plants. We're not amending soil. So a lot of the soil is dry and can be compacted. So that water is not as readily available to the plants. And we really need those plants to anchor. So it's really deep waterings that are infrequent. So the day before I plant, we soak at least 2 inches deep. The day of planting, which would be the next day, we'll soak it again. And then around 4 to 6 days later, same thing, we'll soak it around 2 inches deep. And you'll do that every 4 to 6 days for like the first month. And then you can kind of drop down to every couple weeks. And then it's kind of up to the status of rain. If we have a summer like we did this past summer, I encouraged first year gardens to clients to water through September. And then spring, once soil temps are above 50 degrees, you just want to cut everything back to around 8 to 12 inches. It's not as complicated as that sounds. There's a website, just type in soil temperature map uh, by zip code, and you can see like years and years of data, projected data, and current temps. But once it's 50 degrees, kind of like throughout, a couple weeks, and it feels like we're right there at that edge of spring, just cut it all back, weed whacker, hand cut it back. If you have to, you can mow it if you can raise your blades up high enough, but you got to be careful that you're not hitting the crown of the plants.
Okay. Can you describe the paper weed barrier again? You put the paper down, then you added the almost composted mulch, and then you put the plants in that.
Yeah, so we'll scalp the grass. We use a weed whacker, just as low as you can. Then we'll roll the paper out, and then we'll cover it in about 2 inches of the triple shredded, aged wood chips. And then, yeah, we'll soak it 2 inches deep. We'll let it sit hopefully around 2 weeks, but a month is great as well. Let it really settle and work on smothering, and then we'll come back, soak it, and plant the next day. And we just plant straight through the paper. I really recommend, especially with plugs, getting a mixing drill. So it needs to be a pretty sturdy drill. This isn't like a indoor drill you might use to hang pictures. Um, but if you can get your hands on that in a 3 inch by 36 inch auger from somewhere like Planting Power Planter, that's the brand we use. We can, if I'm alone, I'll plant 500 plugs in an 8 hour day alone. If I have help and we have more than one drill running, then I mean, we can get thousands done in a day using that method.
Okay. Let's talk about sedges. First of all, which one do you recommend?
Pennsylvania sedge is going to be the most it's going to have the widest range of sites. As long as there's just a little bit of moisture, they can do full sun, and they can go all the way down to full shade.
Okay. And do you find that they tend to dry up leach fields for septic systems? Would you recommend something like that?
So the sedges aren't going to have a very extensive root system. They're a lot more shallow than our grasses are. Um, so yes, I mean, it's going to be better than turf grass. Well, that's what I would say. What I would really recommend for a leach field is getting seeds from somewhere like OPN Seeds. That's my go-to source. They're located in Ohio. Everything's like grown and collected here, and they have leach field specific, like septic safe seed mixes.
Okay.
So I would usually go that route with it. You're going to get more more success with that.
And what about deer control? Do you find that they eat the sedges?
So sedges, no. The biggest worry with sedges is in the fall. Squirrels, if they smell that you've dug up anything, they go and they love to pull plugs out of the ground. And because we're talking, 6 inch at most deep roots, they're pretty easy to pop out. So that's really the big thing to watch out for with sedges, but they're pretty much wildlife proof, unless a deer is just trying it or pulls it out with their mouth. Like that might be the most they'll do, but they're not something that wildlife consumes.
So do you ever put like barriers or anything to try and stop them?
Yeah, yeah. So here in Columbus, the urban deer population, it's a real problem. It's been on the city's radar for a while now. There's parks right down the road from me where they'll walk right up to you. So some of the gardens we do have to use fencing. Otherwise, it's selecting those deer resistant plants the best you can. Um, and then at the end of the day, the other great part about these matrix gardens are that we're using so many plants that a little bit of damage here and there, it can recover. You don't really notice it. It's not like you planted that one plant, now they just ate it.
Okay. Let's see. So do you happen to know how deep the little pond in the Tiffin yard was?
It's not very deep at all. I think it's maybe like, I mean, no more than a foot. It's really shallow. It's specifically for birds. He's a big bird watcher. I think like that center was about a foot deep, and that allowed him to grow some lily pads in there. But most of it is really shallow. He basically found online a company that has these big carved bowls, and they like epoxy the pebbles all over it. Looks really
Nice.
natural, and just dropped it in with a pump.
That's cool. Is hosta native?
It is not, no. So it's a Eurasian plant. Yeah, I call them statue plants. They aren't a plant that is invasive, but non-native, non-beneficial. Not really one that we will remove it if we're planting our native gardens. But it's definitely not the first one I'd tell people they need to go out and dig out.
Okay. And once again, the name of the source and can you spell it of flats?
Yeah, Izel, it's Izel. So that's probably the best site because you're getting that in between cost. It's not quite wholesale, which you need a nursery dealer license for in an LLC or some kind of business. And it's not full retail like you would find at like Prairie Moon or Prairie Nursery. A lot of the plants you can get for just a couple dollars each, up to maybe $3, $4. So it's a lot cheaper. And what's great too is that they are selling from lots of different sellers. So you can actually locate where each seller is and just shop from there so that you can try to get plants as close to your your zip code as possible, and hopefully from within your eco region at the bare minimum.
Got it. So that's also a great source of research for the sociability too.
Exactly. Yeah, they have so many filters. It's a really great. I mean, I use it just to go in and like search plants and get new ideas and see what people are growing.
And a couple of questions about do you have any thoughts on using compost, straight up compost instead of the wood chips?
So I don't really recommend it. So you run into two things. It can kind of act as a fertilizer. If we add too much uh, nutrition right off the bat, again, it can encourage really shallow roots and weak root systems. Also, the moisture retention can be too high. Um, it's just kind of hard to work with. It gets muddy easier. Those wood chips allow for some oxygen exchange too. We really don't want to smother it to the point where it's just there's nothing being exchanged. And that's why I never recommend plastic solarization. Um, that kills all soil life. And then on top of that, you now have this like petroleum-based plastic that you have to deal with, and that's not going anywhere for a long time.
So do you try to use plants from different plant families in your gardens?
Yeah, so we typically will pretty much always, when the site allows for it, we're going to have at least a milkweed, um, which there's poke milkweed if you're in the shade, all the way up to butterfly weed, common milkweed. We'll always have an aster and a goldenrod. Same thing. Our aster and goldenrod families are very large. There's at least a dozen of each that are native to the state, ranging from full shade to full sun. And those asters and goldenrods are both of those are keystone species. So they're just kind of home run plants. So besides those three families, then we'll just kind of branch out from there based off of the vibe of the garden, what the client's looking for. Um, but yeah, those three we really try to incorporate.
Okay, got three more. How
Okay.
deep is the wood bark in the that you put over the paper?
Yeah, so about 2 inches. If you can get away with one, that's great. Um, but yeah, anywhere between 1 and 2 inches. I don't go over 2 inches because we don't want those plants to be too, you don't want too much mulch built up around it. It can cause rot. This is really just to help retain some moisture, help limit weeds because we're going to have 6 inch spaces between everything until they kind of fill in.
Okay. Any plants that are unsafe for dogs to be around?
Yes, there are. So one of the main ones would be Virginia wild rye. The plant itself is okay. It's the seeds. They're relatively sharp. I've read online about cases where dogs will eat the seeds, they'll get stuck in their throat, and then that causes an issue. But as far as like toxins, I can't think of one off the top of my head. But I do encourage you definitely to research that if you have dogs that like to consume your plants.
And cleanup in spring, do you just chop the old down?
Yeah, so we chop it down 8 to 12 inches. We'll leave standing. That 8 to 12 inches is kind of the average zone that our stem nesting bees will use. So if they have larvae in there still, if you're a little bit early, it really minimizes the risk of chopping those out and tossing them. And it also provides some support as the plants are growing back in the spring. They have some like woody stems and stalks to kind of help hold them up. And then I just take that material, if I can, we'll just kind of pile it up somewhere on the property. I really encourage compost piles, even if you're not using compost as a product. It's just great to kind of put back there. Birds will come in and pick up seeds. You can use them. It's really fun to make like dried stem arrangements with them if you're somebody who likes doing that. Um, but yeah, you can also kind of mulch it up and then just spread it around if you'd like. Just kind of keep in mind that if you're mixing all these seeds and then spreading them everywhere, it's going to have an impact on that design
Sure.
over time.
All right. So bottle brush grass, is that also kind of sharp for dogs?
I don't know about bottle brush grass, but it does have a very similar uh, seed shape, but it's a lot softer. When I collect bottle brush grass seeds, I just grab the stem and pull them off. When I collect Virginia wild rye, I'm a little bit more careful because those will stab you. And uh, so just sharp seeds are really what you have to think about.
Okay, and last question that is going to kind of seal this all up. So, what are your tips on how to research plant social ability? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, so I'm going to hold up a book here. It's in arm's reach. So let's see if I can get it to focus. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it to focus. So it's The Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants. This is Neil Dibble and Hilary Cox. This is like just such an invaluable book. If you're talking like full sun for the most part, they do have sedges in here, but they have grasses, sedges, forbs. They talk about that. They'll talk about how they reproduce. They have range maps, the height that they get when they bloom. I mean, everything that you need to know about the plant. And it talks about its natural habitat. This is the closest thing that I found to like an all-in-one. Otherwise, it really takes a lot of Googling. One day I would love to release when I have more time, hopefully someday, I would love to release a whole Ohio Native ranked list.
Yeah. Or another thing is they can contact you and kind of get a little bit of consulting done, right?
Exactly. Yep. So we do everything from consulting to full design and install. So we
How far
typically
north do you come?
so typically we stay within 50 miles of Columbus.
Okay.
But if there were like multiple that we could schedule up on the same day, that would make it, more worth it. Or larger projects. then that's something where we'll do some traveling for.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It was great information. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you maybe in the future for more webinars. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us. Come back in a couple of weeks for our last installment. Can't believe it's going to be March already. So thank you all, and have a great night.
Thank you.